their first lap at Atlanta, which works like a super speedway. They call it draft pack racing track. Does that put them at a disadvantage?
Well, Joe, it's funny that you bring this up as the first question because Hailie actually talked about this herself in her race vlog this weekend, and we'll play a short clip from that for you right now.
There's no practice at all. We're going right into qualifying. And so I was kind of like, man, like this is wild. Very odd, especially for me and this being such a fast track.
Well, there you go. And I got to tell you, Joe, obviously I'm not a driver, but if I try to envision myself in such a situation, I think Denny Hamlin was talking about this on his podcast, and he's won, 50 some odd Cup races, arguably the best Cup driver in history to never win a championship. And he was saying something similar about Daytona last year. And then you take the Xfinity Series and drivers who, are significantly younger, significantly lacking the experience that somebody at that level does or has. And you're saying, we're going to take these drivers and put them on a racetrack that races very similarly to Daytona, very similarly to Talladega. That's a mile shorter, that is more narrow in the corners and on the straightaways. And we're going to throw them out there with 1 or 2 laps of qualifying, whatever it is, and then that's all they get before the race. Yeah, I think that's a massive disadvantage. It's a massive disadvantage, not just for the rookies, but for, anybody at this level who, unless it's maybe like a Justin Allgaier or somebody that, has kind of made a career out of this, or AJ Allmendinger, coming back after spending several years in Cup. The vast majority of the Xfinity Series field is either inexperienced compared to the Cup guys, or they don't have the budgets to compete at that level, are much more independent, maybe don't get nearly as much backing from the manufacturers or as much time in the sim to practice. So to not send them out, for qualifying without a single lap of practice, I mean, you heard it straight from the source, one of the drivers there in Hailie Deegan. I think it's a massive disadvantage, and I don't think it's setting the drivers up very well for the race itself.
I gotta say, as you mentioned, the race itself didn't seem to play out well at all. And probably that was a big factor because compared to last year in this race bin, we saw a lot of caution, a lot of people complaining about it. But this year, it was a very tamed event. But unfortunately, it wasn't because we saw good long green flag racing side by side. But the freight train, the top lane, very hard to pass, very tricky. So how could NASCAR, the Xfinity Series, really expect the drivers to put on a good race when they only qualify? That's their laps, and you don't want to go out there and make a risky move and lose it.
Yeah, I think this question always comes up, and sometimes we talk about how it was kind of ridiculous how much practice we had back in the day. I don't know that we need to go back to that level of practice or anything, but I do think there needs to be a medium between an excessive amount of practice, which continues to cut into the team's budgets and everything. And I understand that the economy's tight right now, people are trying to save money, but I think there needs to be an alternative between that and what we're doing right now, where we're just sending drivers out with no practice at all. I don't think that's the solution. Sometimes I think, if it's a different type of racetrack, maybe sending drivers out without practice can maybe improve the quality of the racing because everybody's, on a more level playing field. But in a case like this, a track that, we've only been going to a couple of times under this configuration in a series like this, where, like I mentioned, a lot of the drivers are rookies or younger drivers who are more inexperienced than you might see in the Cup Series field. I don't know what you're expecting, in terms of trying to improve the quality of the racing without practice. I don't think that that's the intent, but sometimes people make that argument. And, at a track like this, everybody's trying to figure out how the track races in a pack and what their cars are capable of. I think you saw it. I mean, I was very concerned for the Cup Series race on Sunday. And of course, it turned out we got one of the best races arguably in modern NASCAR the last several years, and one of the greatest finishes of all time. But the Xfinity Series, we didn't get that. We got mostly single file parade, not a lot of passing, not a lot of action. Jesse Love, to his credit, put the car on pole, but much of the race was up there leading, and nobody really seemed to be willing to make a move to try to challenge him, and were unable to challenge him. So it was a completely different kind of race that we saw, despite it being the exact same track. And, I think part of that is probably because drivers, weren't too comfortable with their cars because they didn't get any practice time. They just got one hot lap of qualifying, and then they were setting their cars and ready to go race. So I think that you need more than that for drivers to be comfortable enough to take those risks and make those moves when it comes time for the race.